Welcome. You're watching the India Development Debate. I'm Tamanna Inamdar. For the last few weeks now, we've been discussing the economic slowdown domestically and how India can and should cope with it. But signs are increasingly pointing to a larger problem at our doorstep. Germany's GDP has contracted in its second quarter, and experts think it's because their exports are hit. Meanwhile, economic data from China points to a drop in jobs, consumption and factory production, among other things. In the US, inverted bond yield curves have spooked the markets because when short-term yields outstrip long-term ones, it has pointed to signs of a recession in the past. So what do all these signs mean for India that is already grappling with an economic slowdown of its own, made worse by poor credit flow and slowing demand? While there has been a report, and several actually, of a stimulus package in the works from the government, is this going to be enough at this juncture? To speak on all this and more, I'm joined this evening by N.R. Bhanumurthy, Professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, Anant Narayan, a Professor at the S.P. Jain Institute of Management and Research, and Maithili Bhusramat, Consulting Editor at ET Now. Welcome to all of you and thank you for joining with us on the show. Mr. Bhanumurthy, let me first speak to you about the fresh data that we've seen earlier this evening pointing to trouble in different parts of the world. Most of it linked to the US-China trade war. We're seeing the impact on Germany, we're seeing the impact on China, and perhaps that's what we're seeing in these inverted bond yields. How much should India worry at this point?
Yeah, I think Tamanna, whatever the factor that you said, I just saw the news that the Dow Jones has actually lost almost 600 points now in the opening trade. So I think the uncertainty in the global economy is actually building up much faster than many of us anticipated, and the impact on India is going to be very imminent. But when it comes to what extent it will have adverse impact on Indian economy, I think we need to understand how India is connected to the international world. In my view, I think because of these developments in the international market, we may be losing somewhere close to 2 percentage points growth in the current fiscal year alone. And that's how the whole exports, the net exports contributes to the GDP. So in that sense, my guess is that this time, if the current trends in the global economy continues or worsens further, we should be ready for a growth less than 6% in the current financial year.
How are you looking at the data coming this evening? Even as we have set out to speak about the stimulus package that the government may have in the works after a series of meetings with different corporate leaders, etc. The fact is, while we grapple with our own problems domestically, there might be bigger clouds looming on the global stage. Maithili, can you hear me?
Oh, that was it addressed to me? I thought it was addressed to Anand. Yes, actually the external world, the external environment does have a huge impact on the Indian economy, true, because if you remember, before the global financial crisis, one of the main reasons why the Indian economy did so well was because a rising tide lifts all boats. So that did help us in the past, and when the global economy goes into a slowdown, we do also suffer along with the rest of the world. The only plus point that one can say, even though we are now part of the globalized world and foreign trade accounts to close to 40% of our GDP, the fact is that we still have a large domestic economy. So if we get our act together, which of course is a big if, given the way we repeatedly seem to be kind of shooting ourselves in the foot, I think it will impact us dramatically. How much is difficult to say, the way things are evolving so rapidly, as we've seen. Apart from the US-China wars, we are also now seeing trouble in Argentina. So the fact is that yes, we will get impacted by the external circumstances. What happens in the rest of the world, how much is difficult to quantify, which is why it is very important that we get our domestic house in order as soon as possible.
Okay, now how do we get the domestic house in order? Let's come to the next key question. And Anant, of course, I'm coming to you, a word on what we're seeing today, because just speaking about the domestic situation and our problems with demand and sentiment, etc., without the context of what's happening around the world, will become fairly short-sighted. We're seeing an alarming situation this evening with a lot of data coming in. Will our policymakers have to now keep that in mind as they put together this stimulus package which is being talked about?
Well, Tamanna, look, this isn't looking good at all, both from a global context as well as from a domestic context. As Professor Bhanumurthy as well as Maitli mentioned, slowing global economy and the lack of confidence will hurt our exports. More importantly, we could see capital outflows as well, particularly as emerging markets such as Argentina, etc., go through their own shivers. We could see a lack of confidence taking out money from India as well. But to your point on the domestic economy, you're absolutely right. There are weak spots. There are several sectoral issues that we're grappling with. The entire banking and non-bank financial companies space is absolutely weak. It requires a lot of reform. It requires a lot of help. Alongside that, there are other sectors such as power, real estate, construction, airline and shipping, telecom, automobiles, you name it. Plenty of sectors which seem to have deep structural issues which have to be addressed as well. So there are sectoral issues. On top of it, actual factor reforms when it comes to land, labor, capital markets, that doesn't seem to be forthcoming as well. And because of that, we are seeing problems in exports, we are seeing problems in manufacturing, employment, and all of that continue as well. So at the moment, while there is a lot of chatter about a fiscal package or some kind of a stimulus package, both monetary as well as fiscal, that's merely providing balm to what's a painful situation. It is not addressing the core issues which I pointed out earlier. And alongside whatever balm you offer right now, we have to be addressing those core issues as well. At the moment, I'm not hearing any talk about those big issues being discussed.
Let me open up this debate, and I'll come to Professor Bhanumurthy. If anyone has a point to make, please indicate and I'll bring you in about the core issues and the importance of the stimulus package right now, because all of the last few days we've been hearing a lot of it's source-based. These very reassuring voices that the finance minister is meeting, various parts of the industry. She's met with real estate, auto, India Inc. leaders, NBFC, banking, etc., etc. She's listening to them, and that there is something in the works. Now, has this maybe increased the appetite for some kind of a silver bullet which will come and sort everything out?
I think right now there's not much option left for the government other than coming for the fiscal stimulus. And I, for the one, have been arguing for quite some time that the slowdown in the Indian economy has started much earlier than government thinks. It started in the second quarter of last financial year. Now, I think the kind of policy, the fiscal policy, especially the fiscal policy that India has been adopting, I have gone on record saying that we have actually adopted a flawed Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act. And when I say this, I want to little elaborate here. We are very happy with the fiscal deficit coming down, but we are not realizing that the revenue deficit is going up. So we have a situation, the fiscal deficit is brought down, but at the same time revenue deficit is going up, and that's exactly is contractionary in my view. And this has been happening for the past 2 years, and my feeling is that we need to really correct this anomaly as soon as possible. Now, in fact, I was arguing even in the last budget, they should have really gone for the fiscal stimulus so that you can do some kind of front loading on some of the public investments, even at the cost of slipping on the fiscal deficit target. So, I am glad, I think there is a rethink on this whole policy, and I am sure if it is structured well, I think it will have a much larger multiplier impact on all the sectors that both Anant and you have pointed out. So, we should have a policy which will have a larger multiplier impact on all these sectors.
Actually, let's focus a bit more on this sort of stimulus package that everyone is so excited about and what it could entail. all of these are now source-based reports which are filtering in. We don't know what will actually happen. But they seem to suggest on one side increasing the amount of credit available in the system through some kind of stimulus package to NBFCs, etc. And on the other hand, to improve demand, maybe some GST cuts. Do you think that that's the two-pronged approach that the government could take?
Well, the problem really with things like increasing liquidity and ensuring greater credit offtake is that the RBI can only make credit cheaper. You can take the horse to the water, but you can't make it drink. So, however cheap the interest rates become, the fact is unless there are other factors that support demand, you will not find investment or even retail demand for credit kicking off. So, ultimately at any slowdown, you need both fiscal and monetary policy to act in tandem. As Bhanumurthy said, I think there is excessive dependence in the government on adhering to that fiscal deficit number, which is somewhat arbitrary. Fiscal policy as well as monetary policy must be counter cyclical. The only problem is that we should be very sure that the slowdown is because of cyclical factors, not structural factors. And there the problem is that in the Indian situation today, it is partly cyclical, partly structural. So, even as we act on the issues that Anand talked about, factors of reform, reforming labour market, land markets, etc., these are all measures that have short term pain for a long term gain. So, you need to have both. You need to have something that is counter cyclical along with something that addresses the structural issues. So, that is what the key challenge for the government is going to be. Can you address sectoral challenges within the overall framework? And that is going to be quite a challenge, which is why I think the government is not able to come to a decision quickly, because as I said, overarching the entire thing is the view that you have to stick to that fiscal deficit number, and I think they need to get out of that mindset.
You know, this is a fairly, I would say, controversial point of view, because many believe that the fiscal deficit number right now itself is not revealing the full picture. So, then how far do you spread? Anand, you want to come in on this point? It's a very interesting theory, and many apart from Maitri also has proposed it, that now is really not the time to tighten the purse strings.
Look, I'm probably a fiscal hawk, so that's a bias I have. But I'll tell you what my problem and what my fear is. I don't think we have that much of space on the fiscal side. And Professor Bhanumurthy is absolutely right. Our revenue deficit is the real problem, and I'll come to that in a second. But here is the real deal. For the last 2 years now, the actual fiscal deficit is far higher than what we've been asked to believe. And CAG itself has pointed this out for FY18. For FY19, while the government says it met 3.4% of fiscal deficit, I think the actual number is at least 1% higher. If you take the off-balance sheet expenditure being staved away in Food Corporation of India, in Government of India, service bonds, as well as now on the state government side, you also have DISCOMs and the power sector distribution companies growing their debt again. So there is a lot of fiscal deficit which is hidden away. Yeah. Even for this year, for FY20, while the finance minister is targeting 3.3% of GDP, a more realistic number is probably more like 4.5% of GDP, given the absolutely slow collections as far as revenues is concerned. Now, here is the problem. In the past, our experiments with liquidity easing, monetary easing, and simultaneous fiscal easing, as we saw during 2012-2013, has led to structural and financial stability issues, particularly if the global context starts to show some weaknesses, which we are seeing right now. So to me, that it's a very dangerous experiment to go on. There is a lot of clamor for relief, and therefore cutting GST or giving expenditure might sound like the right thing, right palliative to give, but it comes with a lot of risks. Which is why what Maitri mentioned, that the need for key reforms which actually instills confidence is so key, along with any palliative you deliver right now. Even if you feel the need for fiscal expenditure,
like what?
You have to ensure that you actually undertake sectoral reforms in sectors like power sector.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I was just
so here's
coming
power
to that.
sector.
Like
power
what?
sector, for instance, we are kicking the can down the road on that sector, right? So power sector, look, we know that the fuel supply agreements and the power purchase agreements don't make sense. It's not a viable sector right now. distribution companies are not paying the power companies on time, which means the debt is increasing over time. Collections are not enough to pay the distribution companies and the producers at the moment. So at the moment there is this ballooning debt and hole in power sector, which we are just ignoring and kicking the can down the road and hoping this problem will go away. It will not go away. Likewise, take the case of real estate. We know there is a problem in construction and real estate which requires real help. Exports, another big one. Why is it that we have a $60 billion trade deficit with China? Why is it that our own manufacturing is not able to step in? So there are plenty of sectoral issues which we have to sort out.
Okay.
And the need, therefore, to alongside go for factor reforms, land, labor, etc., has to go alongside. Last bit on NBFCs and banking. Look, we know there's a problem there. Yes, banks have been given capital, but there's plenty of NPAs yet to come, whether it's NBFCs, whether it's power, whether it's a NCLT process doesn't seem to be working out. Again, that needs deeper reforms to come through. Last bit on fiscal. Look, one thing I would suggest, which Professor Bhanumati hinted at, I think if we can shift some of the expenditure away from revenue items into capital investments, I think that would be a great thing to do for giving confidence to the economy. But whatever you do is in terms of palliatives, liquidity or fiscal side, I think alongside that you have to have deeper reforms. Otherwise, it will be a bit of a waste.
No, absolutely. But here's an interesting thought. Professor Bhanumurthy, let me come to you, and I know Maithili wants to respond as well. Anand speaks about not kicking the can down the road. Are we really in the space for more operation cleanup? There is one school of thought that thinks that maybe the current situation we're in is a result of some of the cleanup, quote unquote, measures that the government has been taking in the last few years, which has led to this sort of credit squeeze, which has led in part to the issue that we're seeing in the real estate sector, etc., and dampening consumer demand. Do you think we need a larger cleanup right now, or let's kick the can a little bit till things stabilize?
I agree with Anant in terms of many of the micro issues that he had talked about when it comes to sectors. But my guess is that it is still work in progress. You take, for instance, if you look at the banking sector, the cleaning up process has actually started much more than 5 years ago. We still don't know where we are seeing the banking sector is going. And again, there is some kind of a mismatch in terms of the macro policies. In fact, I was been arguing that you should have gone for a very sharp bank recapitalization, because you don't have any other option. By prolonging this recapitalization, you are only going to increase the cost of recapitalization in the future, until unless you don't make this banking industry to start doing its business, you are not going to see the revival in the overall economy, even at the cost of fiscal. That's what I have been arguing. Now, there are a couple of ways to do it. I thought the budget or the RBI should have come out with measures which can increase the savings. And when you talk about the structural issue, one of the biggest indicator of the structural weakness is the declining savings rate in this country, and at the same time increasing the debt in the household sector. Now, at this point of time, I am sure Tamanna, you remember even in February when I argued that this is not the time for cutting the interest rates. Now, what was needed at that point of time was very active fiscal policy and followed by the monetary policy. Now, the fiscal has shied away from taking a very sharp measures at that point of time. Now, the monetary has lost the policy space. So, the sequencing problem in my view is the major structural problem in this country. The fiscal should have come up front and the monetary should have followed.
Yeah, but the pressure was on the RBI to cut rates and cut rates even deeper. Maithili, where do you stand on this very interesting debate? And then of course I want to move on to the demand question, but just a quick word on some of the views that have come forward right here.
What I would agree with Bhanumurthy entirely on the fact that bank recapitalization, we have dragged our feet on it, because the fact is that in the absence of adequate capitalization, banks just shied away from lending, particularly when they had to make such huge provisions. So, had the RBI in fact given them a little bit more leeway, little bit more time in making provisions, because remember these are all public sector banks. So, the question of failure of banks, as in the case of the private sector banks or as in the case of banks abroad, is not really an issue over here. So, had we gone in for faster recapitalization, and along with that, I think monetary policy was accompanied by sensible fiscal loosening. As both Anant as Bhanumurthy have said, it is important that we spend on the right kind of things, and though Anand did talk about the fact that the fiscal deficit is actually much higher than what it appears on paper, the fact is what matters is not the fiscal deficit number per se, what matters is how does it impact bond yields, and there we have seen in fact government bond yields have come down very sharply, in fact by over 100 basis points. So, if as a result of even the supposedly higher fiscal deficit, the number we do not know, we can only guess at what the CAG is saying, the fact is if this is not translated into higher bond yields, particularly because there is no demand from the private sector, then I think the government should pick up courage and spend on infrastructure, spend on those areas where there are huge externalities.
Okay, let's come to one very crucial part of this puzzle, and you know, when you talk about consumption slowdown, recently top management at Britannia talked about how even 5 rupee packs of biscuits were not selling as much as before. Sometimes it is an issue of sentiment, where people get more tight-fisted because maybe they see headlines every day that the economy is slowing down, and then you start postponing expenditure. So, that requires some intervention in terms of changing sentiment as well. Professor Bhanumurthy, how crucial do you see that part of the puzzle? Because we have been a consumption-driven economy, we have seen consumption-driven growth, you know, for a long time now.
Yeah, I think the same sentiments have been expressed by the surveys, you know, released by the RBI during the monetary policy, recent monetary policy. So, the overall, I think the consumer confidence seems to be at a lower level. Now, what needs to be done for that is that, you know, you have to have an expansionary fiscal policy. Now, household don't consume, the private sector don't consume, and even government don't consume. So, in that kind of situation, the overall consumption demand seems to be coming down. So, I think this is the transitory part of it. Now, as Maithili said that we have both a combination of structural slowdown as well as cyclical slowdown. Now, to revive this cyclical slowdown, I think we should have gone for an expansionary fiscal policy. There was no other, it is a clear textbook policy measure. I think we should have really gone for the temporary fiscal expansion should have been a right measure to revive these consumer sentiments in the country right now.
Okay, Maithili, you want to weigh in on that part, because you know some have suggested now, you know, let's start putting more money in people's hand, more cuts on GST, etc. The auto sector, of course, for example, has been asking for it. Everyone wants these stimulus packages. Is that what really needs to be done, at least for now, at least symbolically to some extent?
Well, yes, I think the problem of revenue is always there for the government, which is why disinvestment is a very easy option, relatively easy option, because the fact is when the economy is not growing, tax revenues are going to take a hit. The GST is yet to stabilize. So, we are going to see that the revenues will not be as robust as the government estimated. So, this is where disinvestment can come in and play a big role. Unfortunately, the government has been very hesitant when it comes to disinvestment, and whatever disinvestment it has done, it has been basically one public sector buying into another public sector. So, as a result of which whatever money that public sector could actually have invested in terms of greenfield or brownfield investment, that comes down. So, what we really need to do is outright disinvestment, selling it into private hands, that way you get the money for the government coffers, and at the same time there is a change in the kind of leadership, in the kind of management of the public sector, and they get some of the animal spirits, some of the competitive spirits of the private sector. So, I think this is something that the government can do and should do, because that will give it the kind of money it needs to start spending and do that expansionary fiscal, which otherwise becomes difficult in the absence of good revenue, and will also reduce the kind of borrowing that the government needs to do, and helps prevent the kind of preemption of private sector investment which would otherwise have happened. So, disinvestment, I think aggressive disinvestment is one very easy option. Some kind of excess reserves from the Reserve Bank of India will also come. So, to get these two together should help the government tide over the temporary problem. I hope it is a temporary problem, and revenue soon revive.
Well, I'll give you a last word. Anand, you have to fix sentiment, fix demand. Maithili saying the temporary problem can be staved off. But what if we're seeing a larger global one looming?
Look, Tamanna, it's the landscape isn't looking great. A lot of people are drawing parallels to 2007 and 2008 as far as the global landscape is concerned. So we can only hope and pray as far as the global situation is concerned, but we can definitely address our own domestic side. Two quick things which I think can happen. I do agree for a change with Maithili. I do think spending is possible, but it has to be on investments. I think the economic survey and the finance minister was absolutely right in highlighting that investment has to be the way out. I disagree that private investment can fill in that breach right now. I don't think the private sector is in any mood to invest right now. It has to be the government doing the heavy lifting of investing, which it can do with funded through divestments. So if it can do some smart divestments and pump in money into investments, that would be great, and that would do a lot to actually eventually have second order consumption coming through as well. Second part, which I think has to be addressed, is the banking sector. The banking sector is not in a position to fund any kind of investment or consumption at the moment. Bankers are worried about NPAs, about NCLT, about a lot of stuck cases which are stuck. You have to help them isolate all the bad assets into some other entity, do actual recapitalization and reforms of the banking NBFC sector for both lending as well as animal spirits to come back. These two things, therefore, investments by the government and cleanup of a final eventual proper cleanup of the banking and NBFC sector, can go a long way towards bringing back animal spirits and restarting the private side investment cycle.
I like that. Final, eventual, proper cleanup of the banking sector. We'll wait and see how that looks, and whether that stimulus package does arrive with a big message to back it. Maybe we'll hear something in the big speech, or some signs of it in the big speech from the Prime Minister tomorrow on the occasion of Independence Day. We'll be keeping an eye on it. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us on the first debate on India Development Debate. Very short break, but when we're coming back, we're talking about Kashmir and the sort of challenge that former Congress President Rahul Gandhi has thrown, saying, well, let me come to Kashmir. Should opposition leaders be allowed in Jammu and Kashmir at this point? Is it a good idea to keep politics away when the situation is still fragile? We're coming back with that debate. Don't go away.